where you think about small business owners and the requirements from IT, those have changed dramatically over the past 5 years, especially when you think about most of us sat behind a computer desk for the latter part of almost 2 years. And as a result of the changing landscape of IT, it also means that the expectation of what comes from an IT provider also changes. So, what does that mean? What do we need to know?
I don't even know if it's a misalignment yet between, say, providers and consumers, because I don't think the shift is happening as it needs to from either side, right? I think the misalignment right now is between business needs and business, or what's being provided to the business, right? So you
Mhm.
mentioned the pandemic piece, right? That's obviously on the functionality utility side of technology, which is how do we go from more centralized locations to more distributed. That's something that's been happening for, I don't know, it's tough to pinpoint a time frame, but at least a decade, right? But
Right.
it got accelerated during the pandemic, right? And what businesses are finding is it's kind of hard to put the cat back in the bag,
That's
right?
right.
Although many are trying to do that, but the percentage of remote work is going to remain higher than it was pre-pandemic. So in doing that, it's the conversation that all end users have is around how do I make this work? How do I use it? But honestly, for most of them, they're just saying, how do I make it work? Not how do I make it work well? And so when you think about the security of it, you think about the efficiency of it, you think about having a cohesive approach across your entire organization. All those things require your IT team to up its game,
That's right.
right? But if you, as the business owner or the business leader, aren't really focusing on that, you're not asking that of your IT team. And so everybody's just kind of going business as usual with this band-aid on it that, again, it works and continuing to evolve. But there's a big leaking hole in the bucket in terms of dollars. It's this hidden profitability, hidden risk that nobody's been able to put their arms around yet, simply because, frankly, the right skill sets aren't at the table looking at it. This is, again, the connection between technology and business. So,
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to this example of the pandemic, right? I have to imagine folks that were used to being in front of people, especially if you're in sales. If you're selling a product or service, you've got to be in front of somebody tangibly in order to make the business work and to continue the sales journey. And then all of a sudden, you're put in a position where you can't do that anymore. So how do you adapt and overcome? Probably the first thing a salesperson is going to be like, "Well, I got to get in front of them. I need web conferencing." Yeah, that's great, but that's throwing technology at a problem without understanding the people it impacts, the processes that it must follow, the key players and decision makers that are involved. I mean, and it's not, I'm just using the pandemic because I think, Mark, you said it sort of accelerated and highlighted this challenge. But
right.
I can tell you in my experience, oftentimes, whenever there's a problem that comes to the surface, immediately the answer is always, well, let's just find some software that'll solve the problem. But the reality is, you've got to understand the purpose behind it. Like what you said, what's the profitability? What goal am I trying to achieve at the end of the day? Take this technology off the table. What problem are you trying to solve? What goal are you trying to achieve? Who's involved? Who does it impact? How much is this going to cost? How much time is it going to take? These are key important factors that you have to know. And if you don't know those, all you're going to do is perpetuate the problem, probably waste a lot of money, and piss people off at the same time.
Well, there's two thoughts to that, right? Or two aspects that come to mind. One, what you're talking about there in terms of identifying sort of the factors, good planning and discovery, essentially, before you make a change. That's going to give you a much better idea of what your total cost is going to be, as opposed to how many people do it, which is let's implement something and then they figure out along the way, and suddenly this cost 3 times more than you thought it was going to. And while it might be worth the initial investment, it wasn't worth the final investment or the total investment of the initiative. But you're talking about what problem do you solve? Businesses only make decisions in one of three, or for one of three reasons, right? Or at least they really should. It's revenues going up, costs are going down, or we're lowering the risk of something bad happening. So you think about the example you were giving there about web conferencing. That was to facilitate an increase in revenue because suddenly you had to find a new way to sell.
That's right.
During the pandemic, or even you had new products to be able to sell. But as people threw those out there, think about how many instances in the pandemic there were of these new security issues popping up, like with web conferencing. Zoom was high on the list, right? Zoom shot through the roof in terms of their how they were being used, but almost immediately behind that was these, the call bombings, right? The business had changed how the resources were being interacted with without vetting that through the lens of security. So that while they had addressed one issue of increasing revenue, they had also increased the risk of something bad happening.
That's right.
And didn't consider, that element of it. And so I think that the shift that's got to happen, and honestly, this isn't just about IT. This is just what we talk about most often. You've got to have some discipline and structure around those three things whenever you're making any decision. And you can't do that without somebody qualified at the table. I am not the right guy to have at the table when we talk about how do we measure those three things when making a change in HR or in sales and marketing. I'm the guy you want at the table when you talk about technology and how do you make those changes. Now, here's what you find out though, right? Technology lives in all those things. And that's what we're running into because technology was such a foundational change, right? We're moving physical to digital. That's what's happening. Well, think about everything that lives in physical. It's, people are used to that. It's intuitive, right? We're having a conversation face to face, so there's not a whole lot of concern. I can look around and know if somebody else is looking or if somebody can overhear me, from a security perspective. From a functionality perspective, as long as it's two people just talking, we're all good, right? I don't have to worry about connectivity. But once you move that into digital, it's a whole set of stuff that's no longer intuitive. And there's, probably 3/4 of the people that are in business today did not grow up with this technology. And so therefore it's not baked into how they're used to communicating, and they just don't think about it the same way. And yet it's so baked into the fabric of what you're doing that it's impossible for it not to be impacting every aspect of the business, which is why you've got to have some ability to translate that to business.
When you identify one of those three areas, right? You want to increase revenue, you want to decrease costs, you want to reduce risk, right? Let's take our listeners step by step, the things they should consider, what they should lay out on the table as they identify a need that has to be fulfilled all the way until getting something that fills that need. Let's walk them through. What's step one? What's the first thing that you need to do?
Well, I think what you mentioned earlier, right, is it's what problem am I solving? Right? So once you understand, and it might not be that you're solving a problem, it might be that you're looking to take advantage of an opportunity, right? Two sides of the same coin. But maybe the question is better stated as why am I looking to make this change?
Yep.
There needs to be a clear understanding, not just for yourself, but for the entire group that you're working with about why are we making this change? And, again, that change is being made to address one of those three issues, revenue, cost, risk. But while it may address only one of those areas, you've got to start evaluating it through all three of those, because every change has some impact on revenue, every change has some impact on expense, and every change has some impact on risk.
Hmm.
And so while it might not be the driver, you need to understand the context of those things. Once you've decided you're going to make that change, then you start to look at it and go, okay, cool. What is that going to take? So what's it going to cost? What do we have to invest from a perspective of resources, dollars, time, all the things that go in there. But it's also too, how does that increase our risks? And then do we have some understanding of how it's going to impact our revenue? If, you know, suddenly deciding that you're going to use video conferencing doesn't have an impact on your revenue by increasing your projections or allowing you to have more capacity, why do it?
Makes
Right.
sense.
As we
Yeah.
talked about, nobody buys technology for the cool factor, or at least hopefully they're not. They are buying it to be able to achieve some capability that they couldn't before.
Sure. So, Mark, when you talk about figuring out these three areas and how they impact, who are the key players that need to be involved in that conversation other than the business owner?
Uh, Organizationally, it's going to look a little different for everybody, right? But you're probably going to want to have input from the people who are using the tool, the people who are responsible for the results that it's influencing. So, again, taking this back to web conferencing, you're going to talk about your salespeople. You're going to talk about maybe anybody who's responsible for the results from the sales team. That's operationally, in terms of being able to increase revenue. You may have some feedback from whoever is handling your financials, about, when you talk about the budgeting and developing that. And then, of course, you're going to have somebody from a technology perspective involved in that conversation to be able to help you map the how to, what the software is capable of and how that maps to business process. And then also to be able to help you understand the risk aspect from a security piece.
That's right.
So, not to overlook this, but the business process itself should be developed by the people who are using the product, right?
Absolutely. 100%.
In terms of as part of your process, it doesn't have to be 100% baked, but you got to have some idea of how your organization is going to use the technology, as well as you've got to have some idea of the impact, and then how to make it consistent, from one user to the next.
Absolutely. And what I find quite fascinating about this conversation that we're having right now is we haven't even started to talk about technology. We haven't even started to look at software by itself. What do we talk about? We talk about the problem that we're solving. We talked about the key stakeholders that we're getting involved. We're talking about bringing the right folks to the table, making sure a process is in place. We're talking about making sure you have a budget that fits into your overall goal. But we haven't even scratched the surface on technology. And I guess the point that I want to bring out here is that in order for that technology or whatever it is to be successful, you've got to have the people and the process in place way ahead of time, right? Because if you don't take the time to develop and do what you just said and methodically take that approach, the moment that you pull on technology first versus doing all this other stuff, you're going to introduce variables, you're going to introduce problems into the equation, and you're probably going to introduce more distractions and more work than you necessarily needed. And you're probably going to get, I mentioned, piss people off. You're probably going to get people on your bad side.
Yeah, well, it's everything we were talking about is about decisions, right? Decide first, act second.
Mm-hmm.
And not every decision requires the same level of overhead, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It is possible. Like, I mean, you can suffer from paralysis by analysis, right? But that's not really applicable to what we're talking about here, right? What we're talking about here is we've decided that we're going to act. Then you need to decide how you're going to act. And doing, the challenges as an individual, I'm always able to process that much more quickly than even three people, right? Because three people got to be on the same page. You and I have a number of conversations where we have different perspectives. You got to iron those out so that we can act as one, as opposed to, just going and making something happen without really fully understanding all the ramifications. And so, but once you've got a good handle on that decision piece, like I said, you've got to still decide how to act, right? You've got to be able to implement these tools in a way that I'm not saying you'll never increase your risk. I'm not saying you'll never increase your cost, and I'm not saying you'll never decrease your revenue. But you have to understand kind of how much and what the trade-off is for you. Like
That's
you
right.
as an organization, what is it that you want to accomplish here? We're going to increase revenue by 10%. And because of that, we can live with a risk increase of 5% or a cost increase of 8%. Or I don't know, whatever numbers make sense. But how often is that conversation taking place before you put it in, before you put something, go make a purchase, right?
Mhm.
Like how commonly do I see in small businesses where somebody goes and buys something and then decides this is how we're going to implement it? And that's a challenge. It's it's always just it costs way more than it should doing it that way. And often the counterbalance to that is, well, we need to move quickly. In almost every case, no, you don't. Like you've created an expectation for yourself that you can do something in a week simply out of thin air.
Mhm.
And then once you go to look at putting it in place, it's going to take 3 to 4 weeks to do it right. It'll take 2 weeks to do it poorly. And then when you do the 2 weeks poorly because you felt like you had to have this in place, it's not going to be effective. Nobody's going to know how to use it. It's going to cost you more than you thought. You're not going to get the results you looked for. And then by that time, you spent 8 weeks, if you even do it at all. You spent 8 weeks to do what it could have taken 3 weeks to do if it had just been done appropriately up front. And it reminds
And
me of one of my favorite sayings: nobody has time to do it right, but they've all got time to do it twice.
and I think this from in my experience, this is a symptom of the small business mentality. Oh, I'm too small. I don't need to worry about all this stuff. I don't have to go and build all these processes. It's just us and a handful of people. I can take care of this. This is easy. And you're right. They get in their own way. They have this mindset that it's super simple. But the reality is, if you have aspirations to grow your business and grow your revenue, and you want to go from a 10-person company to a 100-person company, guess what that takes? It takes people, it takes more mature processes, it takes organizations to work cohesively together to get there. But if you take the small business mentality of, I'm just going to do it this way without focusing on the people in the process along the journey, you're never going to get to 100 people. It's not going to happen because you're going to fall into this constant flux of what you just said, spending 8 weeks to do something, if you ever do it the wrong way, spending more money than you had to spend, instead of taking the time, the due diligence, even though sometimes it may seem painful. But if you do it right at the infancy of your business and you grow and you scale it up accordingly, you will watch and see how the scaling becomes quicker, it becomes easier, and because you're more mature and you know how to go from A to B because you've already done the due diligence, you've got experience maturing that process over time.
Well, to clarify too, though, Mike, this isn't about getting from 10 to 100. This is about getting from 5 to 10,
That's
in
right.
terms of employees, right? I mean, you start to see these challenges with only 5 people in your organization. And you can kind of brute force through them if you want. But to your point, everything is harder that way, right? Every inch up the hill, it takes more effort for less return. And the to your point, small businesses often think these things don't apply to me because they're not thinking in terms of thousands. And that's okay, because the majority of small businesses will never get over 50 people. So does that mean none of this applies? And that's the thing, is that the answer is no, it doesn't mean that. Again, going from 5 to 10, this is applicable. And the change in the landscape that we've talked about for technology, the change has made this much more accessible. Technology is much more accessible. So what small business owners have been focused on and have thought, and this is where I think that the miss has come from many of us, we focused on the benefits but we haven't focused on any of the costs. And I'm not talking about the dollars. I'm talking about the things that come with that. So when you go and use the technology to grab those benefits, you are also absorbing the risks, whether it comes from security or functionality or reliability, whatever. You're absorbing all of those things. But for many of the small businesses, they aren't considering that side of it because they don't have someone in their organization that can help call out those challenges. It's not about putting more overhead on your decision-making process, although this will put a little more overhead on your decision-making process. It's about, what is it? It's an ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure.
That's right.
Same thing here, right? I'm going to spend $10 before I make decisions to save myself $100 from acting without deciding and planning well. So, the point for me is going to be about all of this, that business owners have to recognize that the technology is not separate from their business.
That's right.
It's integrated. It's a shared responsibility model. Like, your technology is not going to be successful just because you have an IT guy. Your technology is going to be successful because you have an IT guy who understands your business, and not just the responsibilities on the IT guy. The responsibility is also on you as a business owner to be open to engaging and creating time that when you're making decisions, your IT people are part of that conversation. Because without that, none of this really matters. You aren't creating any more value for your business. You're just going to continue doing stuff the way you always have. And, as we've talked about, you don't lose 20 pounds without making changes in your in your diet and exercise, right? You have to make changes in how you operate if you want changes in your results. And that never comes from buying a new technology. Continuing the weight loss analogy, right? Cool, I bought a treadmill. Yeah, it doesn't really matter.
That's right.
So, it's, as this whole conversation is really about this misalignment, I think, between what businesses need and what they recognize, and therefore what they're trying to get. That's where we've got to get this alignment. And there's some responsibility on the IT provider side. There's some responsibility on the IT consumer side, about upping the game for what everybody needs and is using.
Agreed 100%. And the last thing I'll say on this is, you mentioned it before, right? It's a process. It's a business process. Small businesses, you're not exempt. You know why you're not exempt? It's called a business process for a reason. It's a process that is for business, regardless if it's small, medium, or large, right?
Right. It's not called a small business process. Absolutely.